Hello, welcome back to my channel. My name's Ghodsee, and today I'm going to be doing a video focused on 10 different books from my collection that relate to the theme of Women's History Month, which is in March, as well as keeping with the theme of International Women's Day, which was last Saturday. I know this video is a little bit late, it's past that, but still within the month. So I will be going over some nonfiction as well as fiction that deal specifically with women's issues, that deal with feminism, feminist themes and theories, and then the fiction also deal in general with just women's issues, motherhood, sexuality, women in the global south, women of color in America, whole kind of list I got going on here. So if any of those sound interesting to you, stick around and we will get started. So the first book on my list is called Why Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism and Other Arguments for Economic Independence by Kristen R. Ghodsee. I know, if I was a bigger YouTuber, someone would come in the comments and be like, why don't you go to Venezuela or North Korea? No. Okay, so Kristen Ghodsee acknowledges that, yes, 20th century experimentations in socialism in Marxist-Leninist states failed, but we can't just write those countries off because, again, relates to capitalist realism. Is there no alternative? There were some good ideas that a lot of these thinkers had, and particularly with regards to women's rights and equality. And it's not really well known, but International Women's Day, which was on March 8th, was actually started by socialists. The first International Women's Day was declared by Lenin in the Soviet Union. And there is actually a photo in this book of the first woman to, I think was like her idea, Clara Zetkin. She was the founder of International Women's Day in 1910, celebrated each year on March 8th. So each chapter in this book opens with a socialist, feminist thinker. Some of these date back to the 1800s. And so the book is an examination of why capitalism is not really the best deal for women, because generally the kinds of jobs that we take outside are often lower paying jobs. And then there is the whole idea that throughout history, housework and the private sphere and child rearing, that has always fallen on women. And so we are doing two different jobs at the same time, our outer job as well as our public job and our private job. And so when women tend to benefit more from redistributive policies that have better social safety nets for women. So access to healthcare, access to contraception, public education, housing, because I believe women overall globally tend to make up most of the world's poor. And so the book is a pretty good examination of, it looks at some of like the socialist theorists and thinkers, as well as even the role of women within the Soviet Union. Of course, she is not without critique, right? Someone like Stalin, who was a monster. But women overall in the Soviet Union did have a certain kind of advancement that was not really seen in other countries. She mentions that like the first female astronauts were the Russian Soviet astronauts, at the time when Betty Friedan was writing The Feminine Mystique, and talking about housewives, the privileged middle class white women housewives that were bored with their lives. Soviet women were going into space at this time. She talks too about the sexual economic theory and how in a very cutthroat free market capitalism world, women are more likely to rely on trading sex, not directly as sex workers, though that does happen as well, but more likely to enter marriages simply for the sake of economic stability. And this is not obviously good for women or for men. So in order to have a more egalitarian society, women do benefit from more socialist kinds of economies. yeah, anyway, I think this book, it's like very short, and she only focuses on, they're more like European socialist thinkers. Yes, she focuses on women in the Soviet Union. She doesn't really talk about women in the global south in socialist countries like in Cuba or Bolivia or Chile before they got couped, or Vietnam. So, but overall, I think this is a pretty good book that is a really good antidote to girl boss, corporate, lean in feminism. And it's good, I think, to look at history and learn from it in order to move forward and to create a better world. The next book I have here is called Why I Am Not a Feminist by Jessa Crispin, a feminist manifesto. Spoiler alert, she is a feminist. I read this book a while ago. This is a very short, quick, little, I think it's under 100 pages, or 150, but the font is pretty big. It is a critique of modern day feminism, modern day mainstream liberal feminism, which is why she says I don't want to be associated with these kinds of feminists, because they have watered down feminism so much that it's just become super corporate, which happens to every radical civil rights movement, right? She says that she wants us to go back to more radical, transformative kinds of thinking, tying into the last book about how in order to have true liberation for women, we need to think beyond just, electing more female CEOs, but what does democracy look like in the workplace? We need to move beyond this idea of choice feminism. I do it, therefore it's empowering. She mentions, like, again, kind of like radical thinkers like Andrea Dworkin, and how Dworkin is so lampooned, but that we tend to always punch at radicals, even though they're the ones that created a lot of really groundbreaking theories that we tend to just not give acknowledgement to. I have issues with Dworkin because I don't really I think some of her views were a little bit like too black and white for my taste. It's a pretty good piece about how modern day feminism has been co-opted to serve the worst excesses of capitalism and imperialism, and, just taken away from its radical roots. The next book I have here is called In Defense of Witches, The Legacy of the Witch Hunts and Why Women Are Still on Trial. This is by Mona Chollet and has a foreword by Carmen Maria Machado, who wrote Her Body and Other Parties. I think this book is a little bit different than what you might think. It is not like Silvia Federici's Caliban and the Witch, which goes into great detail about the witch hunts in Europe and later in America, and how that was transferred over into European colonization in other colonies. So this book does touch a little bit on the witch hunts, but it is more about how women who don't fit like a certain kind of norm are always castigated and shunned and receive a lot of emotional and physical abuse and disgust by society. Women who are childless, women who are unmarried, women who are just aging and existing in society. I mean, I think it's a little bit like a kind of liberal feminist at times. There is some reference to intersectionality and women being seen as scapegoats throughout history. The one thing I remember is she touches on the stereotype of the welfare queen by the Reagan administration, or actually before the Reagan administration, when Reagan was the governor, and how Black women were seen as leeching off of social welfare programs. And that's how the Black woman as a scapegoat was a way to turn white America away from social services and the welfare safety net. So yeah, it's basically like an overview of like when women step out of line between what is seen as normal and how they are castigated and shunned and made as scapegoats. Not really so much about witches, but pretty like a good overview of just sort of the misogyny that women face today in more of like the Western world, though. The next book I have here is focuses on the global South, specifically the MENA region, Middle East, North Africa, is Headscarves and Hymens, Why the Middle East Needs a Sexual Revolution by Mona Eltahawy. I think I've discussed this book before in my Arab writers video. I think this was published in 2015, so not that long after the Arab Spring. And Mona Eltahawy, she is Egyptian. I think she's Egyptian American. She touches on how women had roles actually in the Arab Spring and then in the creation of these new governments, some of which tended to be very conservative. Their rights were just pushed aside. Actually, I think I read somewhere that this happened in other revolutions too, like in the French Revolution. And so she talks a lot about like the state of women within the Arab world, and there's a lot of focus on purity culture and how any form of a very religious purity culture that seeks to control women in terms of their sexuality and how they dress is very damaging, very traumatizing. She talks about like her own experience and her own experience veiling and her own experience not getting into a sexual relationship with a man until she was in her late 20s. She ties purity culture actually in the Middle East she makes a parallel to purity culture in America with Christian fundamentalists, and how there also this insistence on virginity specifically for girls, and the sort of like Madonna whore complex, and how women are seen as, you know, you have sex, therefore you're dirty. I mean, unfortunately, I feel like the ties to the US really resonate now with where our country is going in the current administration. So yeah, I think this is like a decent book into like women's rights within the MENA region and the status of them. But my one criticism of it is that she doesn't talk about how, I feel like the elephant in the room is imperialism and the constant meddling by the US and the West within these countries to extract their resources, and how progress has been stalled because it's kind of like you can't sit back and relax because there's always some sort of like authoritarian that is going to come into power and just squash whatever progress is made because the West wants to extract oil or, you know, whatever. I think it's good to focus on women in the global South. The next book I have here is Bad Feminist by Roxanne Gay. I'm sure some people have probably heard of this book before. This was published in the mid-2010s, and so it is a collection of personal essays with a feminist slant, coming from the perspective of Roxanne Gay, who is a Black, queer, feminist woman living in America. And it's kind of like a fun, very easy, accessible read, analyzing a lot of trends within pop culture, whether it is music or TV shows, but looking at them from more of like an intersectional feminist lens. In the 2010s, I feel like there was this sort of explosion of very accessible pop feminist essays. Jessica Valenti is one that comes to mind, Rebecca Solnit, and of course Roxanne Gay. And I do think that of all of them, not Rebecca Solnit, I have a book by her and I was looking at it and I thought it did not age so well. But Roxanne Gay, I do think has aged well. And so even if you look at some of these pop culture references, such as like an analysis of Robin Thicke's Blurred Lines, which came out like, 11, 12 years ago now, I think her analysis and writing still really holds up to this day. So yeah, it's like a pretty good, I think, like basic feminism 101 from an angle that is really accessible and not academic at all. The next book here I have, which will be my last nonfiction book, is Three Women by Lisa Taddeo. This follows, it's nonfiction. It's sort of like an investigative reporting. It follows 4 different women in the US and their lives, specifically their sex lives and their sexuality, and how it was formed as young women, and where they are currently. And so one is a housewife living in the Midwest who has this very sexless relationship, this very sexless marriage, and she engages in a very passionate affair with an old high school crush. One follows a very wealthy woman, I think, living in somewhere on the East Coast, and she ends up having this open relationship with her husband. One follows it's 3 women, duh. And then the third follows a young teenage girl, 17-year-old, who has an affair with her teacher, I believe, in North Dakota. And this is all a real case. And what happens there, because of course she's the one that gets blamed, even though she's 17 and he's the adult. And so I thought it was really fascinating and compelling, and it was a really good portrayal of like a really frank discussion of women's sexuality and lust and desire in a way that I think hasn't really been explored too much within a lot of writing. I think we tend to look at women's sexuality still to this day as being either very performative for like the male gaze or for like commodification, or very like sterilized. Let's just say that word, because I don't know. I know what word I'm trying to say and I can't. Very sterilized in the context of monogamous marriage. So it's either like commodified, hypersexual, or sterilized and you're married, that's it. And so I thought it was pretty compelling and fascinating following these 3 women who come from very different walks of life and have very different experiences, but all butt up into society's still rather restrictive beliefs on women's sexuality. Now getting into some fiction, I think deals with some feminist themes. The first book I have here is called The Good Mother by Sue Miller. I read this a long time ago, and the story is about a woman who is recently divorced and she has a daughter, and she ends up in this very passionate but sort of toxic relationship with this man. And then he is accused of sexually assaulting her young daughter, and so she has to decide between, is she a good mother or is she a sexual being? I don't remember this book too well, but it did stick with me. I read this over a decade ago, and I think it was published in 1986, 2 years before I was born. So it's actually pretty cool that she was writing about this stuff in the mid 80s. Like, I think society doesn't really view mothers as being sexual beings, unless of course in the context of like porn, but like outside of that in real life, I think we still again tend to box women's sexuality once they are married and have children. The next book I have also deals with motherhood and fertility, is My Year of Meats by Ruth Ozeki. This takes place in Japan, and it follows this campaign. I didn't look this up, but sort of how Japan tends to be a culture that doesn't eat a lot of red meat, and so this is the back. It says, a Japanese television show sponsored by an American meat-eating business. The documentarian lands a job producing the show called An American Wife, and she discovers some unsavory truths about love, fertility, and a hormone called DES. Meanwhile, on the other side of the globe, Akiko Ueno, a beleaguered Japanese housewife, struggles to escape her child-craving husband. I don't really remember this book that well, to be honest, but I thought I will have to reread it. But it does, I think, deals with questions of motherhood, women's ambiguity, and anxieties surrounding that, and how women who are not interested in having kids, they tend to get not listened to, they tend to get pushed into that. So yeah, not bad. And the next book I have here, second to last, is called Post Traumatic by Chantal V. Johnson. I read this a couple years ago and I really loved it. I finished it in a couple days. This almost, if you read the back, you would think, oh, this is like a sad girl in NYC type of novel. But it transcends the sad girl novel because the main character, there's so much more complexity to her and the people in this book. The main character she's a lawyer who works on behalf of mentally ill patients in a New York psychiatric hospital. And internally, she is struggling with her own trauma growing up, hence being called post-traumatic. And she has also struggled with an eating disorder, and she like fills her life with not just like dieting and trying to like get down to a certain look, but also lives in this sort of like constant state of hypervigilance and fear of men. She has like these catastrophizing thoughts that she is always in danger, and also tries to fill her time with like smoking weed with her best friend and going on dating apps with guys. The thing I think that's interesting about this is that the main character is Black. She is actually, I think she is like Afro-Latina. She is Black and Puerto Rican. And I feel like you don't often read these kinds of stories about women who come from that background. Particularly, like I said, when you think of like the sad girl and NYC type of novel, you always think of a white woman. And specifically dealing with the topic of restrictive eating, that again is also seen as like a white woman's disorder. And so I think this would be from the lens of an Afro-Latina woman was really interesting, and that's why it stuck out to me. And there's so many things in this book that are just so relatable about like the modern political moment, with particularly with like love and relationships and dating, and just like struggling, I think, in general, to like overcome your own family trauma, and like how do you move on and heal from that, hence the term post-traumatic. So yeah, I really like this, and I think it's like a pretty good exploration of getting into a woman's psyche and how she interacts with people in her life. And the last and final book I have here is Against the Loveless World by Susan Abulhawa. I have mentioned this also in my Arab Writers video. I picked this book because it deals with a Palestinian woman, radical and political prisoner. And I think it transcends the idea of women in the Middle East as being all subservient victims of patriarchy, because I mean, yes, there is some of that in this book, but the main patriarchy in this book, you could say, is the Israeli occupation. And I think most people are not aware that Palestinian women have always been on the front lines fighting for their freedom. So this tells a story of a young woman in an Israeli prison cell in solitary confinement, and goes back over her life as to what led her to that moment. From being a refugee, living in Kuwait, working as a sex worker during the first Gulf War when Saddam Hussein invades, to then fleeing back to Palestine as well as Jordan. And yeah, I think it's a really good portrayal of, like, you could say, like, anti-imperialist decolonial feminism. I think, like I said, it's really important to look at women's struggles outside within the global South and see the other systems of oppression that they are up against. And yeah, I think this is my favorite book of Susan's. So that's it. I hope I gave you some reading suggestions to look into. I think all of these books are worthwhile and all deal with women's themes throughout the globe. And yeah, if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, comment, subscribe, and I hope you all have a happy Women's History Month. There's still a couple weeks remaining, and I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.